Hello, thank you for joining today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Colossians. Today we continue in chapter 3 and we are in verse 22 again. So let's go ahead and take a look at verse 22. Again, as always, we want to get the full context, the literary context of what we're talking about here. So we go back to verse 18, read through to chapter 4, verse 1. That will give us a full literary context, what's going on in this letter that we're reading when we look at this particular sentence. Yesterday, we got a chance to take a look at the other context, the historical context of slavery, the cultural context of slavery, but we need to go ahead and take a look at the literary context. So what's going on in the verses before, the verses after the verse we're going to take a look at. So go ahead and read that when you get a chance. Today we're looking at verse 22. It says this: Slaves, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. So we are going to take a look at this today in terms of how does this relate to us here in America. We know that when we read the Bible, that is certainly for a certain people at a certain time in a certain situation. But we also know that the Bible is written for all peoples of all times in all situations. So we can't just allow this to go away and say, well, we don't need to pay attention to it because we don't have slavery anymore. Instead, what we need to do is say, well, how do we apply these verses to slaves and apply them to us today? And what we recognize, as Marla said in the comments of yesterday's teaching, she's right, which is that today what we can do is go ahead and take a look and see how we as employees work with our employers. And that's valid. Now, we do want to make the point that even in that situation, it's not 100% the same, because in the slave world back then, the slaves had to obey. That's the word, obey. It doesn't give the ability to push back or to disobey. That wasn't an option. Today, we don't have that. We are not slaves. We are simply workers. If we don't like something, we can leave. We can quit. We can resign. We can retire. But if we want to work as good workers, we need to go ahead and do what our bosses are telling us to do. So with that, it's not quite obey like the Greek word obey here means, because we certainly can push back and say, well, maybe this is a better idea, or maybe we should be doing it this way. And most bosses should probably be listening. So it's not quite the same kind of obedience, but it's still the same concept of how we should do the work that we're doing. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. It says, obey those who are your masters on earth. So again, we would say those would be our bosses or our managers or people on top of us. Not with external service as those who merely please men. And that's important. When we do our work, we don't want to do our work just to make it look good. I know a lot of people feel that as they do their work, all they need to do is the minimum. They said to do this, so that's what I'm doing. That's not the right attitude. Now, externally, did you do what you were told to do? Absolutely. Can you get fired for doing that? Probably not. But Paul's not talking about anybody. He's talking about Christians. So as a Christian, we're not to just do the minimum to get by. We're not supposed to do just what looks good or might give us credit for things. We're supposed to do more than that. And what is that? We're supposed to do it with sincerity of heart. In other words, when we work, we're giving all of ourselves into that work. We're not just doing the minimum amount to be able to get by. We're going to do this perfectly as best we can. We're going to do it with excellence. Why? Because God gave his son. He gave us his best. Jesus gave us his life. Our response to that is to give ourselves totally and completely to whatever we're doing. So we need to do this not with external service as those who are merely pleasing men, but with sincerity of heart. And the second part is fearing the Lord. So when we do these things, we recognize that, yes, we have an earthly master, our managers, our bosses, but we're not doing it just to please them, to get that minimum amount. We're going to do the best work we can. We're going to do it to the extreme ability that we have, so that when we're done, nobody can point to us and say, you could have done better. We know we've done the best we can. And when we do that, we're doing that not just because we want to look good, not just because our bosses told us to, but because we're fearing God. And when we think about fearing God, we recognize that fearing God is understanding who He is. It's also understanding what He can do, but it's also understanding that concept of respect and awe. So we're in awe of who God is, and therefore we respect who He is. And God is telling us that this is the kind of worker we need to be. So that's the kind of worker we need to be. So with that, that's how we kind of translate these verses on slavery to us today. How do we work? Are we working the right way? Are we doing our work the way we should be? That's how we're going to apply these verses to us today. So with that, thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, go ahead and put them in the comment section below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Until then, thank you so much for all that you guys are doing for me. I appreciate your sharing these things and putting in the comments. I really do. I look forward to doing this again tomorrow. And until then, have a wonderful day, and God bless you.